Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful to the Humanities Festival for having me here and for the Spencer Foundation for supporting this talk. This means a lot. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here. Is that? Could we make this a little bit darker if possible? Thank you. A few years ago, the art critic James Elkins put ads in newspapers and magazines asking people to send him stories about paintings that made them cry. And he put together these stories into this wonderful book, Pictures and Tears. Now, some of the stories that Elkins recounts make sense. People describe being brought to tears by the sort of paintings that depict things that if they were to see them for real would make them cry. So many people were brought to tears by Picasso's Guernica, which depicts the pain and tragedy of war. Sometimes these paintings had personal resonances. So an English professor wrote to Elkins and described a painting that his wife did of an empty bed. And a few weeks after she completed this painting, she left him for another man. It's not that funny. And then he's looking at the painting one day and he thinks about it and he begins to cry. And those are perhaps, moving stories, but there's no puzzles there. But some of Elkins's respondents said things that were very puzzling. The paintings that made most people cry were in this building, in a chapel in Houston, Texas. And they were the paintings of Mark Rothko, which are giant purplish black canvases. People would describe sitting on those benches over there, looking at the paintings and weeping. That's kind of a puzzle. A different sort of puzzle, but related, I think, is the more positive emotional responses elicited by paintings. This is a painting by Ed Ruscha. It's called Talk About Space. It has the word space written on top in yellow and a yellow line at the bottom. And somebody must have liked this very much because they paid $3.5 million for it. And this is kind of a puzzle too. What is it about this sort of thing that could elicit this much regard, this much liking? Modern art is filled with such puzzles. The most important, the art critics were asked a few years ago to nominate the most important artwork of the last century, and it was this. It was Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, which is one of the most important and influential and in some way beloved artworks of our time. But to many people, it looks a lot like a urinal. And it's kind of puzzling how this could have its exalted status. And of course, modern art is filled with such examples. There's Damien Hirst's Cows and Formaldehyde. There's a recent piece by Tom Friedman, which is a piece of paper mounted on a canvas, and it's called 1,000 Hours of Staring. And it's called that because Tom Friedman looked at this piece of paper for 1,000 hours. And this is, again, an important and very expensive artwork. These are puzzles of art that I'm interested in. Now, these are puzzles that arise with more modern pieces, but the same sorts of puzzles, I think, emerge with more traditional pieces. This is a painting known as The Supper at Emmaus, and in the 1940s, when it was thought to be painted by Johann Vermeer, it was worth millions of dollars. It was perhaps literally priceless. It was in Holland, and it was one of the most renowned paintings in Europe. People would travel through Europe to see it. Until one terrible day when it was discovered that it was not painted by Vermeer at all, but by the great forger, Van Meegeren. In other words, it was discovered it was not this painting, but that painting. And all of a sudden, its value dropped to nothing. In fact, I grew curious as I was writing my book, what happened to the forgery? Because it wasn't in that museum anymore. So I did extensive research, I Googled it, and I found out that it was actually in a small museum in Greenwich, Connecticut, which was about an hour away from my house. So I got together with a family, we drove up one weekend, and I'm in the museum, and I'm facing that artwork, which used to have guards around it so vandals wouldn't destroy it. And it was in a museum that was essentially empty with nobody around, nobody watching it. And I had this fantasy of grabbing it, picking it up, and running to my minivan, throwing it back, and driving home. But if I did that, the headline would not be, greatest art theft of all time. It would be, deranged professor steals worthless painting. What happened to it to make it lose value? How do we explain these phenomena? Well, there's an answer to this that many experimental economists and psychologists and evolutionary psychologists propose, and that this is flimflam. And this was nicely summarized by Steven Pinker. So Pinker writes in How the Mind Works, arts engage not only the psychology of aesthetics, but the psychology of status. Modern and postmodern works are intended not to give pleasure, but to confirm or confound the theories of a guild of critics and analysts, to épate la bourgeoisie, or to baffle the rubes in Peoria. And what he suggests, following a lot of work in sociology, that what these artworks are, people don't really like them. Rather, they're conspicuous displays of wealth and discernment. Any moron can get pleasure from a beautiful painting. But for me to spend a fortune on, say, a perfectly white canvas shows that A, I'm very rich, and B, I can see things that normal people cannot. And so Pinker wonders whether this can explain all of the mysteries of modern art. And I think there's some truth to this. I think to some extent, these social factors of status do affect how we perceive art and how we value art. But what I want to try to convince you in this presentation is that this is not the whole story. I want to try to convince you there's something else going on. Something that psychologists have called essentialism. And the idea of essentialism is we don't just focus on superficial aspects of things. Rather, we look deep. We are obsessed with origin and history. This is natural, universal, hardwired, and irresistible. And I want to suggest that this explains much of the pleasure we get from art, but also from sex, food, and the rest of life. Now, I got interested in this from my work in developmental psychology with babies and young children, and I was originally interested in a certain specific puzzle of art, which is how do children name artworks? How do they name representations? How do they name pictures? What determines what they call them? Now, we know for adults, the story is complicated. For adults, we often name things based on all sorts of factors that don't have much to do with what they look like. My favorite examples here are from Picasso's work. So this is a portrait, and anybody in the know will tell you it's a portrait of Gertrude Stein. Now, famously, it doesn't look at all like Gertrude Stein. In fact, one of Gertrude's a story, probably apocryphal, of a friend of Gertrude Stein going up to Picasso and saying, "This looks nothing at all like Gertrude." And Picasso says, "It will." But we know it's Gertrude Stein because he intended it to be of her. Similarly, we know this woman is a woman and one of Picasso's lovers, not because of any particular physical resemblance, but because we know that's what he intended to depict. We know that for adults we could reason something can be a picture of something else, even if it doesn't look like it, so long as we can infer that the artist wanted it to be that. Now, what about children? This is true for an adult walking through a museum, but do young children have the same sort of powers? And if you read the psychology textbooks, they'll tell you they don't. The standard line by developmental psychologists, which the sort of stuff I would present in my own lectures, was for young children, pictures are named based on what they look like. If something looks like a bottle, it's a bottle. If something looks like a person, it's a person. Now, they become sophisticated, more adult-like later on in life, but much later, probably as a result of schooling and culture. And this makes a lot of sense, but there's one problem with it, and this is children's own drawings. This is my son, my younger son, Zachary, and Zachary would do a lot of drawing, and I noticed something very odd, which is he would do the drawing, and then he would name the pictures he drew, but his names had no connection to what his pictures looked like. So here's one of his paintings. And I asked him, "What's that?" And he said, "It's an airplane." But it did not resemble an airplane. And it's not just Zachary. This is from a book by Maureen Cox, this wonderful book called Children's Drawing. I'll read you the caption. "Mummy by Gareth, aged 4 years, 7 months. This figure seems to have no body, and the limbs protrude from the head." Now, there was no accompanying picture of Gareth's actual mother, but presumably, although this bears some resemblance to a person, it doesn't particularly look like any person in particular. So what made it his mother? What made it Mummy? What made Zachary's painting airplane? And the idea I explored, and this is in collaboration with a graduate student of mine now at University of Washington, Laurie Markson, we explored the idea that for children, just like adults, the intention of the artist can determine what a picture represents and what it should be called. So we then embarked on a series of experiments to explore this. So for instance, in one set of experiments, we asked 3- and 4-year-olds to draw 4 pictures. We asked them to draw a picture of a balloon, a lollipop, themselves, and the experimenter. And the logic of this was children that age can't draw well enough to draw something that a balloon that looks different from a lollipop, or one person from another. So if they named them based on what they had intended them to be, they couldn't be doing so on the basis of appearance. And in fact, that's exactly what we found. If the child intended the top picture to be a balloon, she'd call it a balloon. If she intended to be a lollipop, she'd call it a lollipop. If the bottom picture was a picture of herself, she'd say, that's me. If it was a picture of somebody else, she'd say, that's you. We also found the same effect with their naming of drawings of other people. So we would have a situation, you would be the child here, we'd be closer, but you'd be the child. And in between us would be like a fork and a spoon. And I would stare intently at one of the objects and draw a picture, and then show it to you. Now this study was, and then say, what is this? Now this study was actually deceptive because the picture was actually pre-drawn to look intermediate between a fork and a spoon. What we find is for young children, also for adults, but even for young children, another study, even for 2-year-olds, what they'll call this depends on where I was looking when I drew it. If I'm looking at the spoon, they'd say that's a spoon. If I'm looking at a fork, they'd say that's a fork. And this study and other studies suggest that even for kids, when we name art, the intention of the artist matters, not merely what the art looks like. And so, going back to the idea of essentialism, we are to some extent essentialists when it comes to how we talk about artwork. But we look deep. I wondered, though, is this also true for pleasure? Do we also look deep when determining what we like? Does this depth of perception affect our preferences for one artwork versus another? Again, the consensus is no. The consensus is there's a simpler way to understand why we like art. And I think the simple theory has some merits to it. So the simple theory goes like this. Artwork gives pleasure to the extent it mimics the perception of nice to look at real-world objects. So, for whatever reason people like to look at fruit. We like to look at fruit. But you can't always have fruit around when you need it. So, you get a picture like this, and you look at it, and it kind of reminds you of fruit, and you're happy because it's sort of a fruit substitute. Anyway, that picture there. And in fact, this has some explanatory merit because the sort of pictures we like in the real world are things like landscapes and attractive people, children, animals, plants, and social occasions. The sort of things we like to look at in art are the same things we sort of like to look at in the real world. I don't want to shock anybody, but this is a theory that actually works, I think, best for pornography. So, for whatever reason, we like to look at attractive naked people. But you can't always have attractive naked people around when you need them. So what you do is you find a two-dimensional representation of an attractive naked person. You could do it like a picture or a painting, or I'm told the internet has pornography on it. So you go to Google Images, you type in attractive naked person. What comes up on the screen is pleasurable to the effect that it mimics upon you the impression as if you were looking at a real person. It's reality light, it's a substitute. And I think this theory has some merits. It was explored and somewhat satirized in an experiment by an artistic piece by 2 Russian performance artists named Komar and Melamed. And they wanted to use what they call the methods of science to determine the most wanted painting in America. So they hired a polling company to poll 1,001 Americans and ask Americans what they like to see in paintings. Turns out Americans like traditional styles, landscapes and other outdoor scenes, water, wild animals, children, historical figures, and the color blue. And they put this all together into one magnificent painting, which I'm about to show you now, which is the most wanted painting in America. And for those of you sitting in back, that's George Washington there. Now, their intention was satirical, but I want to tell you a few things about this. First thing, it's a bit dark in this room, but it's actually, when you see it, if you go on the web, you can see it to a full extent. It's a fairly attractive painting. It does look kind of good. Second, they redid this experiment in many other countries, like Kenya and Japan and Switzerland and Poland and all sorts of places around the world. And the pictures, the most wanted paintings across all these countries, turned out to be kind of the same, supporting the idea of a universal aesthetic. Finally, this is the sort of thing that that looks good probably because if you were to come across it in the real world, you would get some pleasure from it. And again, it sort of fits with the idea that art gives us pleasure because of its mimicry, because it affects us as if it was a real thing. But we also know that that can't be the whole story. And we know that can't be the whole story for many reasons. It can't be the whole story because we get pleasure from art that doesn't mimic the sort of things we like to see in real life. We get pleasure in art, such as the work by Jackson Pollock, which many of us get great pleasure from, but it doesn't mimic anything. It's not a representation of anything directly in any obvious sense in the real world. Another problem with this theory was presented by Aristotle in the Poetics. So Aristotle writes, "The sight of certain things gives us pain, but we enjoy looking at the most exact imitations of them, whether the form of animals which we greatly despise or of corpses." Now, you might not agree with Aristotle's examples, but the point is a good one, which is we sometimes like to look at something in art that we wouldn't want to look at in the real world. When I was in Madrid, there was a gorgeous painting of a Saturn devouring his child. And it's this gigantic painting, and I was transfixed by it. It was beautiful. But of course, if I left the museum and was walking back to my hotel and saw this on the street, I would not be pleased. It's the sort of thing which is lovely in a painting, not so lovely in the real world. And finally, you have the case of forgeries. So you have the case where something which was, when it was thought to be by Vermeer, this was a priceless masterpiece. When discovered to be by Van Meegeren, it became virtually worthless. Yet, the painting struck the eye in the same way. Whatever changed wasn't what it looked like or what it resembled. What changed was how we thought about it. So how do we explain these sort of puzzles of artistic pleasure? I think the answer, again, is essentialism. I think we look deep. We are obsessed with origin and history. So when it comes to art, what we like is powerfully influenced by our belief about what it is we're looking at, how it was created, who created it, under what circumstances, and so on. This theory is not original to me. It was defended by many other people, including the philosopher Arthur Danto. And Danto says something interesting. Danto says, you might think this is something very strange about art, that we're so obsessed with who did it, is it an original, is it a forgery? But Danto says, you know, in fact, this is more general. This applies to pleasure more generally. So he writes, part of sexual pleasure is surely the belief that one is having it with the right partner, or at least the right sort of partner. He says the same thing about food. The food may turn to ashes in one's mouth the moment one discovers the belief to be false, the belief that you're eating a certain thing. Say that it's pork if one is an Orthodox Jew, or beef if one is a practicing Hindu, or human if one is like most of us. And because he's a careful philosopher, he parenthetically adds, however good we might in fact taste. I like his examples of sex and food, and I want to start off with them. These are stimuli that I've used in some of my experiments. And in the absence of any other information, people judge this to be a fairly attractive man and a fairly attractive woman. But what we also know is how attractive you find these characters is critically determined by who you think you're looking at. If you were to discover that the person on the left was female instead of male, or the person on the right was male instead of female, it would affect your sexual and romantic response. It would affect your response as well if you were to learn that one of them was much older or much younger than they look. It would affect it to a great extent if you were admiring one of them, perhaps with some sexual feeling, and then you discovered that this was your brother or sister in some sort of disguise, or your child. It would have an effect on you, because knowing that someone is a relative shuts off sexual desire typically like that. You could just still say, look, they're attractive, but the sexual feelings will go away. We know from several laboratory studies that the more you like somebody, the better off they look to you. So if you ask people in a happy marriage how attractive your spouse is, and they filled it out anonymously, In a happy marriage, people think their spouse is far more attractive than other people think their spouse is. Because in a happy marriage, they love their spouse and think the world of them, so they look better to them. It also matters which specific individual you think they are. And there's a broader point here. We fall in love with and we're attracted to specific people, not just appearances. George Bernard Shaw put it quite nicely. Love is a gross exaggeration of the difference between one person and everybody else. And I want to illustrate this with two examples. One of them very esoteric, the other one I think more common. The esoteric one comes from a neurological disorder known as Capgras syndrome. Capgras syndrome is fairly rare, but it's been attested many times. It's a tragic disorder where due to something like a brain injury or a stroke, people develop a specific delusion. And the delusion is that the people they love the most in the world have been replaced with perfect duplicates. If you had Capgras syndrome 100 years ago, you might assume these duplicates were demons or monsters. If you have it now, you might assume that the duplicates are, foreign spies or robots. The result of Capgras syndrome is typically tragic. People have murdered their relatives, believing them to be imposters. But in at least one case, Capgras syndrome had a happy ending. And this was in a case reported in 1931. Researchers described a woman with Capgras syndrome who complained about her poorly endowed and sexually inadequate lover. But that was before she got Capgras syndrome. Then, she was happy to report she has discovered that he possessed a double who was rich, virile, handsome, and aristocratic. She was looking at the same guy, of course, but believing he was a different guy caused her to think about him differently. There's a play by Isaac Bashevis Singer that turns around this. It involves this guy who's a total schlemiel, and he's fallen out of love with his wife. He looks at her, and he's unmoved, nothing, just doesn't care about her. Frustrated, he leaves. He's going to discover a whole new land. He walks away from his town. But he gets confused, and he gets lost, being a schlemiel, and he ends up turning around and walking right back into his old town. He believes, however, he has encountered a new land where people just so happen to look like all the people he had left behind. He sees his wife, he's powerfully aroused by this sexy new woman, and falls passionately in love with her. The second case was actually, and this is, I know Wendy Doniger spoke at this festival a few days ago. This is called the bed trick. And I also think it illustrates the effects of belief on sexual and romantic desire. The bed trick is a term coined by Shakespearean scholars to describe something which happens over and over again in Shakespeare's plays, which is when you find yourself in bed with somebody who is not who or what you thought they were. And Doniger summarizes the bed trick has been a cause of concern through every literary tradition, every culture, every religion. People are obsessively worried about making that sort of mistake. One particular version of the bed trick is the panic some straight men have of finding themselves in bed with somebody they believe to be a woman, but who's actually a man. But the bed trick shows up in all sorts of manifestations. The Hebrew Bible has several bed tricks at its core, including one where Jacob believes he is going to bed on a marital night with Rachel, but Rachel's father switches his daughters, and there's a lovely passage in the Bible. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah, for the people had been switched. And this matters to us. Food. How many of you would eat that? The answer, I would think, is it depends. What is it? Some of you would eat it if it was chicken but not beef. Some of you would eat it if it's beef but not pork. Few of you would eat it if it was dog. Fewer still would eat it if it was human. And some of you would only eat it if it was a very strange form of tofu. That much is obvious. What's more interesting is, put aside your choice of what to eat. How you taste something is critically affected by what you believe you're eating. And this shows up in all sorts of ways. One nice finding involves children. How do you get children not just to eat their carrots and drink milk, but after they have the carrots and milk, to report that they tasted good, better than your normal carrot, better than your normal glass of milk? It's actually terribly simple to do this. This was done in a study a couple of years ago. You take them out from a McDonald's bag. Now you might think, well, that's kids. Can this happen with adults? But in fact, a lot of the research on the effects of our perception on our experience has been done with a very adult sort of beverage, wine. So how do you make somebody believe the wine they are tasting is much better than they normally would? Well, the answer we fully well know. Pour it out from an expensive bottle. So several studies use the design of pouring wine out from two bottles. I don't know anything about wine, but one of these bottles says Grand Cru, which I imagine is good. The other one says Van Ordinaire, which I imagine is not good. This has the predictable effect on how people taste it. In a recent study with people just graduating from a wine tasting course, in a final graduation test, they gave the students, they said, we're going to taste this red wine. We're going to give it to you in a black glass so you don't get any cues as to its exact shade, and we want you to tell us what you think of it. And the students tasted it. Some of them figured it out, but others didn't, and said, oh, it's fruit. They described it in terms of a red wine, fruity and so on. Turned out it was white wine. And you could do this at home. If somebody believes it's red wine, they will be strongly influenced to taste it as red wine. I'm not an uncritical fan of fMRI neuroimaging studies. I think they are often overblown and exaggerated, but this is one I like. They get people into a brain scanner, and as they're lying on their back, there's a tube going into their mouth, and they get to drink wine through the tube while their brains are being scanned. Above them is a screen where they can read information about the wine that they're drinking. Everybody drinks the same wine. If they think they're drinking the cheap stuff, they'll report, it doesn't taste so good, and they have a low-level neural response. If they think they're drinking 200 out of a $200 bottle, they say they love it, and the pleasure centers of their brain light up like a Christmas tree. A third case study. I've talked about sex, I've talked about food. Consumer products, everyday objects. One reason why we buy things is because of their utility in an economic sense, because of what they could do for us. From that perspective, you could wear shoes on your feet, you could play golf with golf clubs, and a chewed-up bubblegum doesn't do anything for you. But each of these three objects has value above and beyond its use. The golf clubs were owned by John F. Kennedy and sold for $750,000. The bubblegum was chewed by Britney Spears and sold for several $100s at auction. And in fact, there is apparently somewhat of a market in food that's been partially eaten by famous and important people. One recent example was Obama's Happy Breakfast. The shoes are perhaps the most valuable of all. About a while ago, a Saudi millionaire, according to the New York Times, offered $10 million for this pair of shoes. Now, we don't know if he would have ever paid, but this pair of shoes did have a certain significance by dint of its history for many people. These were the shoes thrown at George Bush in an Iraqi press conference. In fact, there's a bit of a market for thrown objects in general. So I don't know about the shoes, but one Canadian entrepreneur paid $3 million for a home run baseball. Now, in all of these cases, these objects get their value, not because of their physical properties. The golf clubs are no physically different than any other golf clubs. That baseball looks and feels the same as any other baseball, but by dint of their history, where they came from, this matters to us. Now, there's different ways objects could get value from their history. One way was explored by the psychologist Paul Rozin, who noted that contact with negative objects or negative people lowers the value of an object. So people are unwilling, for instance, to wear a sweater that was worn by Hitler, or put on a baseball cap that Jeffrey Dahmer wore. With my colleagues at Yale, I was interested in the question of whether or not contact with admired or special people can raise the value of an object. And this is work I did with my colleague in School of Management, George Newman, and my postdoc, who's now at Bar-Ilan University, Gil Diesendruck. What we did was, we did this with hundreds of adults. We asked them first to name a living famous person that they deeply admired. And one answer that people gave was George Clooney. And then we asked them, how much would you pay for George Clooney's sweater? A sweater that was worn by George Clooney. The answer was, on average, $135, which is quite a lot more than they paid for that same sweater. It wasn't owned by anybody special. Then we asked them about the effects of certain transformations and restrictions. So we took one group and we said, look, how much would you pay for the sweater? But let me tell you something. You cannot tell anybody you own this sweater, you cannot boast about it, and you cannot resell it. It dropped a bit. So people won't pay quite as much. But the other manipulation had an even bigger effect. We said, okay, you could tell anybody you want about it, you could resell it, but before it got to you, it was thoroughly washed. Now it drops substantially. And in fact, there's a real-world case of this. There's a charity that sells clothes that actors and actresses wear to the Oscars, and then they sell it and use the money for charity. And after they were in business for a couple of years, they added to their webpage, said, by the way, don't worry, we thoroughly dry clean the clothes before sending them to you. And people protested. People said, no, don't do that. I want it with the sweat on it. What my wife described as the Clooney cooties. And we also asked how much pleasure would you get from wearing it. It turns out if you tell them they can't sell it or tell anybody about it, it makes no difference at all. But if it's washed, the pleasure drops significantly. Finally, art. If ever there's a case where the origin in history matters, it's with artwork. And this is a point made by Dennis Dutton in his wonderful book, The Art Instinct. So Dutton says the sort of history that matters most for artwork is performance. The value of an artwork is rooted in assumptions but a human performance underlying its creation. I love Chagall. I would love to have an original work by Chagall. But I wouldn't pay anywhere near as much for a perfect copy, even if I can't tell the difference. This isn't only snobbery of some sort. Rather, it's because why I want an original Chagall is because I want the sort of thing that Chagall himself created. I want it to have the right sort of history. A duplicate wouldn't have that history. And I think that captures how many of us feel about art. It's the difference between the same painting by Vermeer and Van Meegeren, which is, in one case, the history of the artwork is as a unique creative work. In another case, is as a cheap ripoff. It explains, I think, differences in taste. So this is Jackson Pollock. How many people here like the work of Jackson Pollock? Sort of a fan. How many people here, it does nothing for them? Just honest, it does nothing. Okay, people here. So there's a difference, and I have an opinion, but all I want to say is that there's a way I could predict that these groups differ. Those who love his work and those who don't. And that has to do with the intuitions of the performance involved in their creation. If you tend to believe my kid could paint that, he just splashed paint on a wall, on a canvas, you're not going to like it very much. If you see this as an intensive and difficult and lengthy process, your attitudes will change correspondingly. And I use Pollock as an example here because there's a young artist who paints in the style of Jackson Pollock who went through exactly the same sort of transformation we saw in the Vermeer Van Meegeren case. And she's a young artist. She's a very young artist. She's Marla Olmsted, who would paint her abstract paintings in the style of Jackson Pollock, among others. And her paintings sold for many thousands of dollars. And this is chronicled in a wonderful documentary, My Kid Could Paint That. What happened was she made what in retrospect was a mistake of allowing the TV show 60 Minutes to come into her house and film her painting. And 60 Minutes did a show on this, and they reported that her father was coaching her. When this came out, the value of her paintings dropped to nothing. They couldn't give them away. And you should get the DVD, because at the end of the DVD, there's an interview with the man who made the DVD, and at a town meeting in the girls' town, Binghamton, New York. And basically, the gallery owner stands up, and you could tell he's furious, and he says, what difference does it make? If you liked the art before, who cares that her father was coaching her? And the guy who made a DVD stands up and says something which to me made a lot of sense, which is he said, look, when you buy art, you buy a story. You buy a history. And when it turned out that it wasn't done entirely by her, the story changed. And that affects how much we like it. Now, psychologists have done very little research exploring the effects of history on how much we like something. Right now we have a lot of stories from the art world, not much experimental research. But I'll tell you about two experiments. One was done in a lab by Justin Kruger and his colleagues. He showed groups of subjects the same painting, but he told half of them it was painted in 6 hours, and the other half it was painted in 26 hours. This subtle manipulation made a huge difference. The people who thought the painting was done in 26 hours thought it was a better painting, would pay more for it, and claimed to get more pleasure out of it. Their beliefs about its origin affected how they felt about it. The second study was done not by a psychologist, but by a journalist, by Gene Weingarten for the Washington Post. And this was not done in a lab, but in a Washington, D.C. subway station. Anybody know who this guy is? With the kind help of the very famous violinist Joshua Bell. So the question that Weingarten was interested in was, how much would people like Joshua Bell if they didn't know he was Joshua Bell? So with his help, what he did was he set up Bell in a Washington, D.C. subway station with his $1 million Stradivarius. And the question is, he stands there for an hour, and I'll show you a little clip from the thing. If he stands there for an hour, how much money would he make? And he's there, hard to see, but he's on the left. At the end of an hour, he made about $38, which isn't bad, but it's not good either. It's sort of what the average person makes. In fact, he made $20 more than that, but he didn't count it because this was, as they put it, tainted by recognition. What happened was, towards the end of his performance, this woman walks by. You can see her on the video if you watch the end of the video. She walks by and she stomps. It turns out she saw Bell at the Boston Symphony Orchestra a while ago and paid a fortune to see him. Staring at him. And finally she goes into her purse, she takes out $20, and she walks up to him, and she drops it in his case and says to him, "I'm so sorry you're down on your luck." Now there's different morals to be drawn from this, but I think one interesting thing is Joshua Bell sounds different if you know he's Joshua Bell. Your beliefs about what you're experiencing transform your sensory experience. Here's another musical case, which I just like because it's sort of dramatic. This is John Cage's work. Comes under different names, but it's often called 4 minutes, 33 seconds, because it was a famous modern performance where the pianist is instructed to sit at the piano and be silent for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Now, as you can imagine, this is fairly controversial. Whether or not this is brilliant or just ridiculous. But my favorite fact about this is you can go onto iTunes and you can buy for $1.99 the entire thing of 4 minutes 33 seconds, which is of course silent. And I've read commentaries on this where people are outraged. They say, "Look, just turn down the volume on your computer and sit there for 4 minutes 33 seconds." But psychologically, I think that wouldn't be the same silence. This is that silence from that performance. I'm a developmental psychologist, so I want to return to studying kids, and I want to ask the question, how natural is this way of looking at the world? To what extent are young children swayed by history when determining what to like? And we're doing several experiments, but one sort of experiment we're starting off with is we're looking at the objects that we have reason to believe children develop a specific, particular attachment to. And these are their security blankets, their attachment objects, teddy bears and security blankets and so on. And the question we're interested in asking is, when children become attached to a security blanket, is it true, as parents sometimes report, that they lock onto that particular one and they will not accept a duplicate, even if the duplicate is perfectly indistinguishable from the original? So this is research I did in collaboration with my colleague at Bristol University, Bruce Hood. And Bruce is an amateur magician, which helped us set up the study. For our first study, we tested 20 children who had attachment objects, and we got them to bring attachment objects into the lab, and 21 children who didn't have attachment objects. We just got them to bring a toy from their house into the lab. And once the children were in the lab, we showed them a duplicating machine. This is a three-dimensional duplicating machine. The way it works is you have two empty boxes. You put something into one of the boxes, like an apple. You close the boxes. A siren goes off, lights flash, and then they drop, and then there's an apple on the other one, too. We did not really have a three-dimensional duplicating machine, but we just stuck in objects through that black curtain and back. Children totally bought it. And children live in a world where there's two-dimensional duplicating machines. Why not a three-dimensional duplicating machine? And then for the first part of the experiment, we duplicated this rubber stretchy man, this red rubber stretchy man, and we asked children who they want to take home with them. And what we found was, for this unexceptional new object, the majority of kids, both with an attachment object and without an attachment object, wanted to bring home the duplicate. They were both good, but the duplicate's kind of cool because it's a duplicate. And we were just interested in that to show kids weren't timid about reaching for the duplicate. What about when kids took the object they brought from home and put that into the machine? Well, for the unattached kids, they treated it exactly as if it was the stretchy man. They just said, whatever, I'll choose the duplicate. Or they won't, either way, but they didn't show a strong preference. For the kids with attachment objects, the responses were quite different. The majority did not choose the duplicate. Only 1 in 4 kids picked the duplicate. Those of you with sharp eyes will notice the numbers at the bottom do not add up to 100%. This is because some of the children refused to put their thing into the duplicating machine. And we currently want to explore what happens when we expose children to duplications of art, both art they make and art other people make, to see to what extent does history matter for them too. I've argued that it matters for our pleasure what we think something is and where it came from. I presented this largely as a theory of the appreciation of art, but what I'd like to try to persuade you to consider at least is that this could extend to the appreciation of everything. It could be part of a general theory of pleasure. Now, a question you might ask when anybody gives you a talk like this is, who cares? Why does it matter? And I will give you two answers to that. One is, I think this is an interesting fact about the human mind. Put aside practical matters. We often think, many philosophers and psychologists and humanities people, when they think about human pleasure, they deride it as simple, sensory, perceptual. We respond to a set of things we've evolved to respond to, and there's no depth to it, no richness. I think it's interesting that this is perhaps mistaken. I think it's interesting to find out, even for pleasures as exalted as an artwork, but as rudimentary as a glass of milk or an orgasm, your perception of it can be transformed by your belief about it, by what you think it is. I also think this has practical value. Like most of you, I get pleasure from art. I enjoy art. This is a good chunk of my life. And it is my strong belief that a better understanding of the nature of pleasure, a better understanding of why we like what we like, can serve to enrich and expand these pleasures of everyday life. Thank you.
So we have 15 minutes for questions. If you could raise your hand, I'll come around, and please keep it brief. Thank you.
What do we know, if anything, about the genetic component of pleasure and how it's distributed in the brain?
There, okay. The question is about the genetic and neurological basis of pleasure. The answer about what we know about this is very little. We know, so there's two ways to ask the question. One is a question about universals. I've made a claim about how pleasure works in general. And you could ask, how is this wired up in the brain? How is this wired up in the genome? And I think the only honest answer is nobody knows. Neuroscience is an incredibly young science and has told us very little about these questions. Same with genomics. We just don't know. I think it's an incredibly fruitful area for the future, but now I think it could tell us very little. A different question is about human differences. Why does sexual preference vary? Why do artistic preferences vary, and so on? There, genetics plays a tool, not at the level of sort of genetic analyses, but at studies of behavioral genetics. And there's a lot of interesting research looking at why are people different? To what extent do our differences have to do with our families, how we're raised, with random events that happen in our life, or through our genes? And there I think the answer is going to differ from pleasure to pleasure in interesting ways. So for instance, one surprising fact about the pleasures we get from food is everybody here, if you listed your 10 favorite foods and your 10 least favorite foods, everybody come up with a list. This list is largely predictable from your culture. Americans tend to like different foods than Koreans. But within a culture, it is very hard, it is a mystery why we like the foods we like. It is not easily explained by genetics. People's food tastes differ a lot from their parents. They differ a lot from their siblings. It is not easily explained by early experience. There seems to be some sort of randomness that we know nothing about, and it's just a great puzzle.
One area where status is used, because I heard stories about some high-class restaurants figure they could serve average tasting foods if they have expensive decor.
There's a lot of research. I'm not sure this is status. So the effect is right, which is if you convince people that it's expensive, it's in a fancy restaurant, it costs more, people tend to like it more. This might reflect status, because look at me, I'm eating food in this fancy, fancy restaurant. Or it might reflect a belief that what costs more is better. And hence that affects the pleasure you get from it.
How about looking at the other way? Could looking at images create sadismus, masochismus, just the opposite of pleasure?
The opposite of pleasure?
Could you repeat the question?
Looking at the other way than pleasure. Sadismus, masochismus, could looking at images create that kind of experience?
Absolutely. The arguments I've made about essentialism and essentialist bias, I've always framed in terms of pleasure, in terms of what we like. But one could easily flip them around. And certainly what counts as unpleasant or repellent or repugnant is also strongly influenced by what we think we're looking at, not just the perceptual experiences. I'll give an example. This isn't exactly what you're getting at, but from a different domain. It's a lovely study done by Kurt Gray and Dan Wegner. And they were looking at pain. What they do is, they got undergraduates and said to undergraduates, we're going to give you painful electric shocks. Strangely, undergraduates love this kind of thing. So they said, great. And then they strap them with electric shock. There's two conditions. Everybody gets the same shocks, the same intensity, but there's two conditions. In one condition, they're persuaded that they're getting the shocks because of an accident, because the machine will sometimes randomly give you shocks. No person behind it. In the second condition, they believe that somebody in the next room is malevolently, cruelly shocking them. They're asked to report how much it hurts. It turns out that if you think you're getting shocked by a random machine, it hurts, but then you get used to it, and it fades and fades and fades. If you think you're getting shocked by a person, it hurts, and it keeps on hurting. You don't get used to it. To be kicked in the shins by somebody hurts a lot more than banging your shin against a leg of a table. Another example where this has been studied has been tickling. So imagine the feeling of being tickled, and you could be laughing, but one could be tickled by somebody they know to be a loved one. If you're standing, at the subway station and somebody starts tickling you, it's not quite the same. So I'm not sure I've answered the question as it was intended, but the point I want to raise in connection with what you're saying is it's not just pleasure.
I have a question about the Joshua Bell experiment. Do you know if there was a control violinist put there and what he or she earned, or was that not done?
The answer is yes. This is a place where there had been other violinists playing, and they made roughly the same amount of money. On the other hand, it was an experiment only sort of in quotation marks. So there's critics of it. Dan Simons and Christopher Chabris argue that talk about this very case, and they say the situation was not conducive to hearing Bell at his best. And if only you would hear him at his best, it would have worked out differently. I doubt that, but that's a legitimate response.
The Rothko piece that you discussed at the beginning, and I heard you just say that made people cry more than others or feel sad. Why sadness as opposed to? Right.
I never explained that. And I don't know, but I have a suggestion, I have a guess. If people believed that these giant purplish black canvases were done by a computer randomly mixing paint, it wouldn't have evoked that reaction. If they believed it was by an anonymous artist, it wouldn't have evoked that reaction. But it was done by Rothko, and my bet is that everybody who showed up and who wept knew something about Rothko. They knew that a year after he completed these paintings, he killed himself. So they registered in this a message that they wouldn't have otherwise registered, and a feeling that they wouldn't have otherwise felt. And I think that partially explains what happened.
Most of your attention has been on our pleasure being enhanced by our ability to discern the intention of the artist.
Yep.
I'm happy that you brought up the Dutton book. I just finished reading it, and his project seems to be to trace back our sources of pleasure to our kind of evolutionary history. And so the reason why we like the landscape
Yep.
is sort of rooted in the preference of our prehistorical ancestors for open spaces where danger was reduced and game was plentiful and that sort of thing. Is that understanding of the kind of evolutionary origins of our pleasure in art also contributing to that pleasure that we seek or we find in it?
I'm glad you raised that. Dutton's book is excellent, and one reason why it's excellent is because he discusses there's many sources of artistic pleasure. And I view this sort of essentialist bias, this focus on intention, as one significant origin. And I view this as an evolutionary accident, a byproduct. We haven't evolved. The fact we care so much about a difference between an original and a forgery is not a biological adaptation. It's a byproduct of the fact we're so interested in history in general. But I entirely agree with Dutton that a lot of our pleasure in art really is a straightforward biological adaptation. Basically, we are often drawn towards art that connects up to things that from a reproductive point of view, it behooves us to like certain landscapes that are just perfect places to be, certain faces and people that are attractive because they're reproductively available and they're healthy and so on, scenes of safety, scenes of adventure. And so any theory of art, there's going to be no magic bullet for a theory of why we like art. Culture plays a huge role in all sorts of unexpected ways. I've argued here that the intention of the artist, the artwork's history, is critically relevant. But I think Dutton's exactly right to point out these sort of more fundamental evolutionary building blocks. There's even another part of the story, which is why do we like certain geometrical patterns and lines and colors? And that might involve a whole other story involving the sort of priming of our visual system and what activates and sort of at a very low neurological level excites our visual system.
There's a true wisdom that you don't get to choose what you love. And I certainly have, that's been my experience. How does that correspond to what you've discovered?
I think the truism is, for the most part, true. In that so much of first thing, there's our evolved tastes and the individual differences between us are often sort of distributed in a way beyond our conscious control. You can't choose to like spicy foods just by an act of will. If you are not sexually attracted to men or not sexually attracted to women, you can't throw a switch and change things that way. So in a lot of ways, things are just beyond your willpower. However, if it's true, which I think it is, that your pleasure is deeply conditioned upon your understanding of something, for wine, for food, and for art, this makes a prediction, which is one can enhance one's pleasure by learning more about a domain. I'll give you two examples. Nobody starts off enjoying classical music for the most part. But as you listen to it and learn about it and absorb its structures, it becomes, in fact, its lack of easy access is often a source of great pleasure. But you have to work at it in a different sense than you have to work at some popular music. Wine is the same way. People might enjoy wine, but you'll enjoy wine more if you take a wine tasting course. Actually, studies find that you will taste it differently. I'll end with Jackson Pollock, which is some people in the room hate his stuff. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. But what I am saying is if you attended to how he created his artwork and learned more about it and understood more about it, it will at least change your perceptions of it to some extent. So you can't, through an act of will, say, I want to like this, I don't want to like that. But you can, through an act of will, say, I want to enhance my understanding of a domain, and therefore indirectly you might be able to change your pleasures.
So this will be our last question, and then Professor Bloom will be available signing books in the lobby afterwards. Thank you.
You cited the importance to our appreciation of art from knowing the artist's intention by virtue of the name that was given. So what's on the mind of artists, and how do they contribute to this phenomena when they choose to call their work untitled?
Right. Philosophers of art have pointed out there's two sorts of untitled works that differ importantly. The first is just works that, for some reason, we don't know what their title is. You discover a painting that no one's known about, and then it's just untitled. But then there's your case, which is very interesting, which is, what about when an artist says, my title is untitled? That's an act of will. That's a purposeful deigning to provide some sort of, not to provide information that many artists will provide. And what artists know, just like novelists know this and movie directors know this, is that there's often a sweet spot of how much information you want to give, how much you want to provide. So what we want to do to some extent when we see an artwork is capture its history. What was it? Where is it from? What does it mean? How was it created? But part of the pleasure of art is doing this for ourselves. If it's transparently laid out in front of us, it's often boring. And so part of art is part of the pleasure of art is actively trying to explore these things. And some artists strategically choose then to make it hard for you in certain ways.